If you have arrived here, it is not by accident. There are moments in life when the outer world appears unchanged, yet something within begins to stir. You may not have words for it, but you feel a subtle pressure, as if an unseen hand is knocking from the inside. This is often how change announces itself, not with noise, but with an uneasy silence that refuses to be ignored. Every genuine transformation begins long before it becomes visible. It starts in the hidden chambers of the mind, where thoughts you once avoided begin to demand attention. Old patterns lose their comfort. Familiar habits no longer provide safety. What once felt certain now feels hollow. This inner disturbance is not a sign of failure. It is evidence that the psyche is preparing to reorganize itself. When the old structure can no longer contain who you are becoming, tension arises. Many people mistake this phase for confusion or weakness. They try to escape it by returning to distractions, by numbing the questions that arise in the quiet moments. Yet the questions persist because they carry a deeper intention. They are not meant to torment you. They are meant to guide you toward integration. What you resist most often holds the key to what you are meant to become. Within every individual lives a divided landscape. What is shown to the world and what is hidden in shadow. The shadow is not evil, it is simply unrecognized. It contains unrealized talents, suppressed emotions, and instincts that were once rejected in the name of acceptance or survival. When change draws near, the boundary between these inner territories begins to thin. You start encountering parts of yourself you once denied. This encounter can feel unsettling, even frightening, but it is necessary. One cannot become whole by remaining partial. You may notice recurring thoughts, dreams, or symbols appearing in your life with unusual intensity. These are not random. The unconscious speaks in images and patterns when ordinary language fails. It is attempting to restore balance by bringing what is hidden into awareness. To ignore these messages is to delay growth. To listen is to begin the dialogue that leads to transformation. Change is rarely comfortable because it demands responsibility. Once you become aware of your inner contradictions, you can no longer live unconsciously. Awareness removes excuses. It asks you to participate actively in your own development. This is why so many people remain stuck, not because they lack potential, but because they fear the weight of becoming conscious of it. If you have arrived here, you are likely standing at the threshold between who you have been and who you could be. Thresholds are unstable places. They belong neither to the past nor fully to the future. It is normal to feel lost here. Yet it is precisely in this uncertainty that new meaning can emerge. Order is not found by clinging to old identities, but by allowing a new inner structure to form. True change does not come from imitating others or chasing ideals imposed from the outside. It arises when you align with your own inner law. This requires honesty, the courage to see yourself as you are, without distortion or justification. Such honesty can be painful, but it is also liberating. When you stop pretending, energy once used for concealment becomes available for creation. As you move closer to change, life may seem to test you. Relationships shift, certain doors close, circumstances that once supported you may fall away. This is not punishment. It is a natural reorganization. What no longer resonates with your inner direction must dissolve, so that what truly belongs to you can take its place. Do not rush this process and do not try to control it entirely. Transformation follows its own rhythm. Your task is not to force change, but to remain conscious while it unfolds. Pay attention to your reactions, your fears, your desires. They are signals pointing toward areas that require understanding rather than suppression. Remember, growth is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming more fully yourself. When the fragmented parts of your psyche begin to speak to one another, a deeper sense of unity emerges. From this unity comes strength, not the brittle strength of masks, but the quiet strength of authenticity. If you've arrived here, your change is very near, not because the world has suddenly shifted, but because you are ready to see yourself more clearly than before. And when perception changes, life follows. Inner disturbance is often the first language through which change speaks. Before clarity appears, before direction becomes visible, there is discomfort. A subtle unrest enters the mind, disrupting routines that once felt stable. Thoughts repeat themselves without resolution, emotions surface without obvious cause, and a quiet dissatisfaction grows even when nothing outward seems wrong. This disturbance is not random, nor is it a sign that something has gone wrong. It is the psyche signaling that an old inner order has become too small for what is trying to emerge. Human beings are naturally inclined toward balance. When the inner world is aligned, life feels coherent, even if circumstances are difficult. But when growth begins, balance must first be broken. The structures that once maintained psychological stability start to crack, because they can no longer contain the full range of inner experience. What once worked now feels restrictive. Beliefs that once provided certainty begin to feel hollow. This inner tension is the necessary friction that precedes transformation. Many people attempt to silence this disturbance as quickly as possible. They label it anxiety, weakness, or confusion and rush to eliminate it. Distraction becomes a refuge. Constant activity, noise, and external validation are used to avoid sitting with the discomfort. Yet suppression only drives the disturbance deeper, where it grows stronger and more disruptive. What is denied does not disappear. It waits, gathering intensity until it can no longer be ignored. Inner disturbance arises when parts of the psyche that have been neglected begin to demand recognition. These parts may hold emotions that were once deemed unacceptable, desires that conflicted with expectations, or questions that threatened established identities. For a long time, these elements remain hidden, pushed into the background so that life can proceed smoothly. But the psyche seeks wholeness, not convenience. When the distance between the conscious self and these neglected aspects becomes too great, tension arises. This tension often manifests as restlessness, irritability, or a sense of meaninglessness. People describe feeling lost without being able to explain why. They may succeed externally while feeling internally empty. This contradiction is not accidental. It reflects a split between who one appears to be and who one actually is becoming. The disturbance is the pressure created by this split, urging reconciliation. Dreams often intensify during such periods, becoming vivid or unsettling. Symbols repeat themselves, carrying emotional weight that lingers after waking. These images are not meant to be taken literally. They are expressions of inner processes that have not yet found conscious language. The psyche communicates in this way when rational thought is insufficient. Paying attention to these messages can reveal what the disturbance is pointing toward, though understanding rarely comes all at once. Inner disturbance also challenges the image one holds of oneself. Traits that were excluded in the past begin to surface. A person who identified as always strong may suddenly feel vulnerable. Someone who prided themselves on control may encounter impulses that resist discipline. This can feel threatening, as if the foundation of identity is being undermined. In truth, the foundation is being expanded. What feels like disintegration is often reorganization. The discomfort of this phase is intensified by the fear of uncertainty. The mind prefers familiar suffering to unfamiliar possibility. Letting go of old patterns means stepping into the unknown, where outcomes cannot be predicted. The disturbance forces a confrontation with this uncertainty. It exposes the limits of old answers and demands new ones that cannot be borrowed from others. This is why inner disturbance feels so personal. No one else can resolve it on your behalf. There is also a moral dimension to inner disturbance. As awareness increases, so does responsibility. One begins to see where compromises were made, where authenticity was sacrificed for approval or security. This realization can bring guilt or regret, but it also brings the possibility of choice. Disturbance is not meant to condemn the past, but to illuminate it. Only what is seen can be transformed. If approached consciously, inner disturbance becomes a guide rather than an enemy. Instead of asking how to get rid of it, one can ask what it is asking for. Often it calls for honesty, for boundaries, for the courage to change direction. Sometimes it asks for patience, for the willingness to endure uncertainty without immediate resolution. The disturbance does not demand impulsive action, but conscious engagement. Avoiding this process prolongs suffering. Engaging with it initiates growth. This engagement does not mean indulging every emotion or acting on every impulse. It means observing them without judgment, understanding their origin, and integrating their message into conscious life. Through this process, the psyche gradually reorganizes itself. What was once chaotic begins to form a new pattern. As the inner world shifts, the outer world eventually responds. Choices change. Relationships are reevaluated. Paths that once seemed inevitable lose their grip. This does not happen because the disturbance forces it, but because clarity emerges from sustained attention. The disturbance weakens as its message is understood, not because it was fought, but because it fulfilled its purpose. Inner disturbance is therefore not a detour from the path, but the path itself at a deeper level. It marks the point where unconscious life presses toward consciousness, where potential seeks expression. Those who endure this phase without fleeing it develop a greater depth of character. They become less dependent on external validation and more grounded in inner truth. What begins as unease gradually reveals itself as preparation. The psyche does not disturb itself without reason. It does so when growth is necessary, when remaining the same would be more damaging than the pain of change. To recognize this is to stop seeing disturbance as an obstacle and begin seeing it as a signal that something within is ready to be brought into the light, that an old inner order is dissolving to make space for a more complete one, that the discomfort you feel is evidence not of weakness, but of movement toward a deeper alignment with what you truly are confronting. The shadow is one of the most misunderstood inner experiences, largely because it challenges the image a person has carefully constructed about themselves. The shadow consists of everything that was pushed aside in the process of becoming acceptable, functional, and secure. It holds impulses that were judged too dangerous, emotions that were labeled inappropriate, and traits that did not fit the role one learned to play. This material does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It remains alive beneath the surface, shaping behavior indirectly, often in ways that feel irrational or uncontrollable. Most people encounter the shadow first through projection. Qualities that are disowned within are noticed with intensity in others. Irritation, judgment, fascination, or moral outrage often point to something unresolved inside. What is condemned externally is frequently something unacknowledged internally. This mechanism protects the conscious self-image, but it also fragments the psyche. The more energy spent denying certain aspects of oneself, the more forcefully they seek expression in distorted forms. The shadow is not composed solely of destructive traits. It also contains vitality, creativity, and strength that were suppressed because they threatened conformity or safety. A person taught to be agreeable may repress assertiveness. Someone rewarded for rationality may bury intuition. Over time, life becomes narrow not because of lack of potential, but because large portions of the psyche have been excluded. The shadow becomes heavy not because it is dark by nature, but because it is unconscious. When change approaches, the barrier separating consciousness from the shadow weakens. Situations arise that provoke disproportionate emotional reactions. Old memories surface unexpectedly. Behaviors appear that feel foreign or embarrassing. This can be alarming, as if one is losing control. In reality, control was always partial. What is happening is exposure. The psyche is attempting to restore balance by reclaiming what was lost. Confronting the shadow does not mean indulging every impulse or abandoning ethical responsibility. It means recognizing these inner forces without denial. Awareness transforms raw impulse into conscious choice. What remains unconscious acts compulsively. What is brought into awareness can be shaped, redirected, and integrated. This is why confrontation, though uncomfortable, is necessary for psychological maturity. Resistance is strongest at this stage. The ego fears dissolution, mistaking integration for annihilation. It clings to familiar identities, even when they cause suffering. Yet the shadow cannot be eliminated through willpower. The harder it is suppressed, the more it manifests through symptoms, conflicts, and repeated life patterns. What is not faced within is encountered outside again and again until it is recognized. Dreams often serve as the meeting place between consciousness and shadow. Figures appear that are threatening, grotesque, or morally ambiguous. These figures are rarely enemies in the literal sense. They represent split-off aspects of the self, dramatized in symbolic form. Fear arises because recognition threatens the illusion of purity. Accepting the shadow requires humility, the admission that the self-image was incomplete. Moral development deepens through this confrontation. True ethics are not maintained by repression, but by understanding one's capacity for harm. A person who believes themselves incapable of darkness is unconsciously dangerous. A person who has faced their shadow and chosen responsibility carries restraint grounded in awareness rather than denial. Integration does not make one flawless. It makes one conscious. As shadow material becomes integrated, energy previously bound in repression becomes available. This energy often appears as increased vitality, creativity, and emotional depth. Life gains texture. Relationships become more honest because there is less need for performance. The individual becomes harder to manipulate through guilt or fear, having already faced these forces internally. The process of integration is gradual. Sudden attempts to expose everything at once can be destabilizing. The psyche reveals what can be tolerated at each stage. Patience is essential. Each insight creates space for the next. Integration is not achieved through intellectual understanding alone, but through lived experience, repeated reflection, and the willingness to revise one's self-concept. There is also grief involved. Integrating the shadow means mourning the loss of the idealized self. One must let go of the fantasy of being entirely good, strong, or righteous. This loss is painful, but it is also liberating. In its place emerges a more realistic, grounded sense of self, capable of compassion without illusion. Wholeness does not mean harmony at all times. It means the capacity to hold inner opposites without fragmentation. Light and dark, strength and vulnerability, discipline and impulse coexist within a unified structure. The individual no longer needs to expel unwanted parts to maintain identity. Inner conflict becomes dialogue rather than war. As integration deepens, outer life reorganizes itself. Situations that once triggered intense reactions lose their charge. Patterns of self-sabotage weaken. Choices align more closely with inner values rather than unconscious drives. This alignment does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes its quality. Challenges are met with awareness rather than compulsion. To confront the shadow is to reclaim authorship of one's life. What was once hidden no longer controls from behind the scenes. The individual becomes less fragmented, less reactive, more present. Wholeness emerges not as perfection, but as coherence. The psyche moves toward balance not by erasing darkness, but by bringing it into relationship with consciousness, allowing previously rejected aspects to find their rightful place within the totality of the self. Where nothing essential needs to be denied in order to exist, awareness begins as a quiet disturbance in the automatic flow of life. Actions that were once performed without reflection suddenly draw attention. Patterns become visible where there was previously only habit. This shift marks the end of unconscious living, where choices are guided primarily by conditioning, imitation, and unexamined belief. Awareness interrupts this momentum. It forces a pause, and within that pause arises the recognition that one has been living inside assumptions that were never truly questioned. When awareness deepens, old identities begin to loosen. Roles that once provided certainty start to feel restrictive. The image one has carefully maintained for years no longer fits the inner experience. This can feel like loss, as if something essential is being taken away. In reality, what dissolves is not the self, but the rigid definition of it. Identity formed without awareness is built for survival, not for truth. Awareness exposes this difference and demands a reorientation. With awareness comes responsibility. Once a pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. A person may wish to return to ignorance, but the psyche does not easily allow retreat. To see one's own contribution to suffering, both personal and relational, is unsettling. Blame shifts inward, excuses weaken. This is often the point where people resist growth most strongly, not because awareness is painful, but because it removes the comfort of unconscious justification. Responsibility does not mean self-condemnation. It means acknowledging agency. It is the recognition that while one may not have chosen the original conditions that shaped them, they are now responsible for how those conditions are carried forward. Awareness illuminates where reactions are automatic, where behaviors are inherited rather than chosen. This illumination creates the possibility of change, but it also creates an obligation to act differently. As awareness expands, inner conflict intensifies. Different parts of the psyche, once kept separate by unconsciousness, begin to encounter one another. Desires clash with values. Fear contradicts ambition. The mind may interpret this as fragmentation or instability. In truth, it is the beginning of integration. What was previously split off now seeks recognition. The discomfort arises not from awareness itself, but from the tension between old structures and emerging insight. Old identities resist dissolution because they are tied to belonging. To question them risks isolation. A person may fear losing approval, status, or love if they no longer conform to familiar roles. Awareness brings this fear into consciousness. It reveals the cost of authenticity and the cost of suppression. Responsibility lies in choosing which cost one is willing to bear. Awareness also exposes the illusion of control. Many identities are built around the belief that life can be managed through rigid planning or moral certainty. As awareness deepens, unpredictability becomes undeniable. One sees how much of life unfolds beyond conscious intention. This realization can be humbling, even frightening. Responsibility in this context does not mean controlling outcomes, but responding consciously to what arises. The dissolution of old identities often creates a period of emptiness. Without familiar labels, the self feels undefined. This state is frequently misinterpreted as failure or loss of direction. Yet it is a necessary interval. New forms cannot emerge while old ones are still rigidly maintained. Awareness clears space before it builds structure. Enduring this emptiness requires patience and trust in the process rather than immediate resolution. Relationships change under the pressure of awareness. Unconscious dynamics become visible. Patterns of dependency, manipulation, or avoidance can no longer be ignored. Responsibility involves acknowledging one's role in maintaining these patterns. This can lead to difficult conversations or painful separations. Awareness does not guarantee harmony, it guarantees honesty. The individual must decide whether to continue relationships as they are or allow them to evolve or end. As awareness continues, values shift from external validation to internal coherence. Approval loses its absolute power. Decisions are no longer guided solely by fear of rejection or desire for reward. Responsibility becomes internalized. The individual begins to act in alignment with inner truth rather than external expectation. This alignment often brings a sense of quiet strength, though it may also bring solitude. There is a paradox at the heart of awareness. The more conscious one becomes, the more complexity one perceives. Simple answers dissolve, moral certainty gives way to nuance, responsibility becomes less about rigid rules and more about contextual understanding. This complexity can feel burdensome, yet it also deepens compassion as one recognizes the unconscious forces at work in others as well as oneself. Avoiding awareness may preserve comfort temporarily, but it exacts a long-term cost. Patterns repeat, conflicts intensify, life narrows. Awareness, though demanding, opens possibility. It transforms compulsion into choice. Responsibility transforms reaction into response. Together, they dismantle identities built on fear and replace them with a more flexible, conscious sense of self. This process does not end. Awareness is not a final state, but an ongoing practice. Each new level of insight reveals further layers of conditioning. Responsibility evolves accordingly. The self becomes less fixed, more dynamic. Identity shifts from something one defends to something one participates in. The individual no longer asks who they are in a static sense, but how they are relating to life in each moment. Through awareness, the psyche moves away from fragmentation. Old identities dissolve not to leave emptiness, but to allow a deeper coherence to form. Responsibility anchors this coherence in action. What emerges is not a perfected self, but a conscious one, capable of holding uncertainty without collapse, capable of choosing with clarity rather than compulsion, capable of living in alignment with an inner truth that is no longer borrowed, imposed, or unconscious, but actively lived and continuously examined as part of an ongoing dialogue between the self and the unfolding reality of existence. Authentic integration begins when life stops being something that merely happens to you and starts responding to who you are becoming within. Inner alignment is not an abstract ideal, it is a living process that subtly but powerfully reshapes external reality. When the inner world is fragmented, life reflects that fragmentation through conflict, repetition, and stagnation. When inner elements begin to integrate, the outer world reorganizes in response, often in ways that seem coincidental but are deeply connected to psychological change. For much of life, actions are driven by unconscious motivations. Choices appear deliberate, yet they are often guided by fear, unmet needs, and inherited expectations. A person may pursue a career, relationship, or identity not because it reflects inner truth, but because it provides security or approval. As long as this disconnection persists, effort increases while satisfaction diminishes. Life feels like constant maintenance, holding together something that never fully feels right. When authentic integration begins, this dynamic shifts. Integration does not mean eliminating inner conflict, but bringing opposing forces into conscious relationship. Desires are no longer blindly acted upon or forcefully suppressed. Values are no longer adopted unquestioned from the outside. Instead, there is dialogue. Inner contradictions are acknowledged rather than denied. This creates coherence, not uniformity. The psyche begins to function as a coordinated whole rather than a collection of competing parts. As coherence increases, external life responds. Opportunities align differently. Situations that once felt compulsory lose their grip. Choices that once seemed impossible become available, not because circumstances magically improve, but because perception changes. What you notice, tolerate, and pursue is shaped by who you are internally. When inner alignment shifts, attention shifts, and with it, the field of possible action. Relationships are often the first area where this reshaping becomes visible. Authentic integration reduces the need for masks. Interactions become more direct, less performative. Some relationships deepen as honesty replaces role-playing. Others fall away when they no longer resonate with the integrated self. This loss can be painful, but it is rarely accidental. Relationships that rely on fragmentation cannot survive integration. What remains is more demanding, but also more real. Work and creative expression also transform under authentic integration. Effort becomes more focused. Motivation arises from meaning rather than pressure. Tasks that once drained energy may be abandoned, while activities that were previously neglected begin to demand attention. This is not impulsive change, but alignment. Energy flows naturally toward what reflects the integrated psyche. Resistance decreases not because challenges disappear, but because action is no longer divided against itself. Authentic integration also alters how obstacles are experienced. Difficulties do not vanish, but their significance changes. Instead of being interpreted as personal failure or external hostility, challenges are seen as information. They reveal where alignment is incomplete, where fear still dictates behavior, where unconscious patterns persist. This perspective transforms struggle into feedback rather than punishment. The outer world often mirrors unresolved inner dynamics with striking consistency. Repeated conflicts, recurring disappointments, and familiar frustrations point to patterns seeking integration. When these patterns are addressed internally, the external repetitions weaken. Life does not need to repeat the lesson once it has been learned consciously. What changes first is interpretation, then response, and finally circumstance. Integration also affects timing. When the psyche is fragmented, urgency dominates. There is a constant sense of being behind, of needing to catch up or prove something. As integration deepens, this urgency softens. Action becomes timely rather than rushed. Waiting no longer feels like stagnation, but like preparation. Decisions are made with greater clarity, reducing the need for correction. There is a subtle authority that emerges from authentic integration. It is not control over others, but self-trust. This authority reshapes interactions. Boundaries become clearer without aggression. Needs are expressed without apology. The individual becomes less reactive to external pressure, not through withdrawal, but through grounded presence. This presence influences environments quietly, often without conscious intention. Outer reality reshaped by integration is not necessarily easier, but it is more congruent. Life feels less divided between who one is and what one does. This congruence reduces inner friction. Energy previously consumed by self, doubt and internal conflict becomes available for engagement with the world. Productivity increases not through discipline alone, but through alignment. Authentic integration also refines perception of success and failure. External markers lose absolute authority. Success is no longer defined solely by recognition or accumulation, but by coherence between inner values and outer action. Failure becomes less threatening as it no longer undermines identity. It becomes part of the learning process rather than a verdict on worth. The reshaping of reality through integration is gradual. Sudden transformations are rare and often unstable. More common is a steady realignment, where small changes accumulate into a significantly different life structure. Patience is essential. The psyche integrates in stages and reality responds accordingly. Forcing external change without inner integration leads to repetition. Allowing inner alignment to lead produces sustainable transformation. As integration continues, life begins to feel participatory rather than adversarial. Events are no longer experienced solely as obstacles or rewards, but as interactions between inner state and outer circumstance. Responsibility deepens without becoming burdensome. The individual recognizes their role in shaping experience, not through control, but through consciousness. This reshaping is not about escaping difficulty or achieving perfection. It is about living in accordance with what has been integrated. The outer world becomes a reflection rather than a contradiction. Actions, relationships, and choices align more closely with inner truth. Fragmentation gives way to coherence. Life no longer feels like something endured or escaped, but something engaged with fully, where inner integration continuously informs outer movement, and the unfolding of reality becomes an ongoing dialogue between who you are and how the world responds to that becoming.